Well, as you can see, you're watching the press preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So over the next half an hour, we'll take a look at what's making the headlines with the columnist Yasmin Alibhai-Brown and the Mail Online associate editor Jake Wallis-Simons. But first, let's take a look at what we have in terms of front pages so far. Starting with the Sunday Times. It reports that US military advisors have told the UK that Donald Trump could launch a preemptive strike to neutralise North Korea's nuclear programme. Here's the Mail on Sunday. It goes with North Korea's unveiling of a new array of missiles. The Sunday Telegraph says that tension between the rogue state and the United States has reached new levels, with fears one of those missiles unveiled could hit America. That's a story also leading the Sunday Express. The Observer says that new figures show that the government's free schools programme benefits more prosperous areas in the south of England the most. Well, as you can see, Yasmin and Jake here to once again take us through the papers. And plenty to discuss this evening, but what was our top story on Sky News for most of the day, the situation, the tension between North Korea and the Americans. Let's start with the front page of the Sunday Times.
Yeah, and many of the papers, as you said, have obviously concentrated on this on the front page. And it is actually, in my view, very frightening what's happening. We've moved from 0 to 100 in how many, 3 days? And it's as if the United Nations doesn't exist, as if, you know, the only options are for us to behave like these two Rambo men behaving as if they're in a movie. And I find this very difficult. But at the same time, there are those who think that it needed to happen, that North Korea was completely out of control and, you know, felt nobody was going to do anything. But I don't think Trump is the saviour of the world. I mean, I'm very frightened by it all, actually.
I'm sure you're not alone in that.
Well, I mean, let's make no bones about it. It is terrifying. It is scary. But in my view, there's one thing that's more scary, which is reaching 2020, which is the date that most experts believe would be the time when North Korea would develop a nuclear weapon, up to 100 nuclear warheads, and the capacity to launch them into the West, Europe and the United States, without anybody having done anything. I mean, that's more scary. I think it's better that it's much better that the United States, as the world's only or biggest superpower with the most powerful army, acts now to try and sort this out before we get to that time. I mean, this has been a problem.
But what are they doing? What exactly are the Americans doing apart from putting a fleet very close?
Well, it's been extraordinary. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. Yes, they've moved this armada, as Trump put it, into the waters off North Korea. But the effect that it has had diplomatically, particularly on China, has been astonishing. China has never before been so sort of aggressive towards North Korea. They've stopped their airlines from landing there. They're threatening to prevent, oil exports and all the things that prop up the North Korean regime. And that would not have happened without Trump.
Well, I think it could have happened without Trump acting the way he is. Trump is a maverick. He won the election on the whole basis that he wasn't interested in being the policeman of the world. It was America first, isolationist. Now he's gone in for this because it's giving him some excitement. So I don't think we should depend. But what you're absolutely right on is the role China now needs to play. You know, the First World War didn't happen as a great grand declaration. In different places around the world, things blew up to an extent and they came together. We're in a bad place. We're in the same bad place. Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, was in a bad place. We cannot have two stubborn, macho, bullish men behaving like this.
No, but I don't think you can draw an equivalence between Trump and the leader of North Korea, or between America and North Korea. The fact is that this is a problem that's been in every US president's inbox for a very long time. Bill Clinton almost had to strike North Korea. Obama stood back from it, knowing that this was coming down the line, ignoring it. This is a problem that had to be addressed, and Trump is doing it in the only way that's going to actually produce a result.
I don't agree with that.
The suggestion, though, is that you mentioned the Chinese, the role they're playing. Part of the job they're doing at the moment is educating Donald Trump in terms of international diplomacy. We learned from the Washington Post this week that it was only after a 10-minute conversation with the president that he discovered, do you know what, guys, this North Korea situation is pretty complex.
And he also discovered, China is no longer our enemy. China was this terrible place, remember, who's raping our economy or whatever. Suddenly now, so, you can't put anything into the hands of this man. And he's more actually, like the leader of North Korea. I really do think he's as unpredictable.
He's
unpredictable.
yes,
that's
true.
all I'm saying.
He's very
unpredictable.
In terms of tactics, though, Jake, I mean, this is concerning for all.
Well, this is the story that apparently the North Korean despot has drawn up plans to kidnap tourists, Western tourists, to hold for ransom if the US were to attack. And what they're planning to do is infiltrate South Korea and take some Westerners from there. And yes, this is scary. It shows a potential overflow into other areas of combat. But at the same time, I sort of think that it shows how impotent North Korea actually is. Because if there is a war, I doubt very much that any Western tourists are going to be staying anywhere near the border with North Korea. They're going to be evacuated. They're going to be pulling back.
Yeah,
and if this is the best that North Korea has got to throw against the West, I think that we haven't got too much to worry about.
But we can't just be talking about the West. This is the world. We're talking about human lives everywhere. So what happens to South Koreans or what happens to North Koreans who've been so utterly oppressed?
But to be fair, this is a story about Western tourists.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is...
You're right, but projections have suggested 20 years ago that if there were a conflagration between the North and the South, there'd be 1 million casualties. I'm not trying to diminish that for a moment.
And also, amongst the casualties would be large numbers of Americans currently based in South Korea. When Donald Trump is doing his calculation as how best to act, that must surely be weighing very heavily on his mind.
It is, and it's weighing very much, even more heavily, I think, on the regional powers, including China. And Donald Trump knows that the only way that anything is going to happen is if there's a real sense that there's a threat in the air, there's a dynamic president that's going to take matters into his own hands if the powers surrounding North Korea don't step up to the plate, as the Americans have put it.
But he's got to show more respect for China. One can think what one does about Chinese human rights violations and whatever. The way he was talking about China and the admiration for Russia during the elections, it's now kind of gone the other way, hasn't it?
Being predictable,
like I said, so quickly.
Being predictable is not always. I mean, I'm feeling slightly anxious about defending Trump, but
no, we don't think you are a Trumpite.
But I've got to say that you've got to give the man credit where credit is due. I mean, there is definitely a sense that he's taking the lid off the toy box and finding what there is to play with, and that's worrying. But we need to give credit to him. He's been producing results on North Korea.
I do wonder whether or not that strike in Syria has perhaps changed the tone and changed the level of expectation when it comes to Donald Trump. Our US correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peters has written a piece today about the ineptitude, as she sees it, of the Security Council. I mean, what other forum is there in which North Korea can be pressured to act? The United Nations, isn't it? The Security Council is a lost cause. I mean, how can pressure be brought to bear on a country which has so much in terms of economic sanctions already on its back?
Well, I think the Security Council is the problem. And I think China now might begin to think and act differently. But I don't agree that it's because Trump, threatened and may even carry out this threat. If he carries out this threat, we do not know the consequences. We do not know the consequences, so we should not go for the violent route. But I think the Security Council absolutely has to change the way it's been operating. Russia has been one of the biggest villains on it. When it suited America, it chose not to support it, all kinds of things. The world depends on the Security Council.
And we saw with the strike on Syria how Trump instantly had to go around the Security Council because the Security Council wouldn't back him, and he knew it. Yeah. I think that there are some serious questions to be asked about the Security Council because by nature it's very cumbersome. It requires a lot of international consensus with different countries with different agendas, and sometimes it's not up to the job. Other times it is. Yes, I think that Trump has to act against North Korea above their heads.
At times like this, all eyes turn to whoever's sitting at the Foreign Office. And it's this man who Boris Johnson in the Mail on Sunday describes as bungling. Is that your assessment, Yasmin?
I'm just very surprised. This is a right-wing paper, and they're Brexit, and he's been one of the three Brexiters.
They're not Brexit, the Mail on Sunday.
Oh, no, Mail on Sunday wasn't. Sorry, thank you.
It all makes sense.
Now it makes sense. Now it makes sense. Okay, I was wondering about that. But it's interesting. They're going quite hard on him. He did have a bad week because he tried to push the sanctions route, which, as it happens, I think is a good policy he was trying to push. I think sanctions have not been used properly against the Syrian authorities and the army men, and all of whom have millions of pounds in our banks and in Switzerland. I think we could do more on that. But he was seen as a failure, and once that happens in politics, that's the story, isn't it?
Just the Simon Walters analysis piece here. The headline, obviously, Ms. Walters didn't write it, but you know, the description of him as a poodle, being sent to the doghouse, woeful. I mean, is that fair on Boris
Well,
Johnson?
I think, you know, Boris Johnson deals it out, and I think he's a big boy and he can take it. And everyone sort of loves to hate Boris in a way, well, not everyone, but some people love to hate Boris and love to, you know, make fun of him and so on and so forth. But I think that there's a very serious matter at stake here, and it is a potential for regime change in Syria, Western influence regime change. I mean, speaking to people at the, you know, who are concerned with this sort of operation. It seems to me that there's a lot of tub thumping going on in America and in Britain. There's a lot of there's a big appetite for war. There's a big appetite for regime
Is there?
change.
I don't know
And
if there's an appetite among people.
it does seem to me as if there's a determination that this strike on Assad the other day is the first phase in removing him. And my worry is that what will happen next. My concern is that the Foreign Office and the Americans and the Security Council have underestimated the extent to which the opposition is dominated by jihadis, and they haven't fully learnt the lessons of the collapse in Iraq and in Libya when those regimes have been decapitated. And I fear it's going to be plunged into chaos.
But, you know, I've never knowingly agreed with anything Boris did. But I think on this he was right, and actually they were wrong to be so dismissive of the sanctions.
Still interesting to note the way in which Number 10 is slightly distancing itself from Boris Johnson at the moment. We will pause there and take a very quick break. Coming up afterwards, Prince Charles meeting with his Transylvanian relatives. See you soon. Welcome back. You're back to the press preview. Yasmin and Jake continuing to take us through the papers, and let's turn to the front page of the Observer, shall we? And an interesting story here. I'll blow it up in just a second, but Britain is set to lose the European Union crown jewels. What's this mean?
Well, this is, to me is not a particularly spectacular story. We're talking about two European Union institutions. The European Banking Authority, which exists to sort of keep a watch and stress test European banks, and the European Medicines Agency, which seeks to sort of harmonise efforts in member states to accept medicines and to put them into use. Now, these are two European Union supranational organisations. Who on earth would think it's a good idea to have them located in London after Brexit? And who wants them? I mean, they're part of the European Union superstructure. They should remain, you know, they should go into the European Union itself once we leave. And, you know, so what?
But isn't the point, as it says in the first part there, that this is, you know, doing this within weeks, that we're not waiting until we're actually formally out of the European Union, or at least until the end of the 2-year Brexit negotiation period. They're doing it now in an attempt to embarrass us, mighty blighty.
But I think it does matter.
How
It
can
does
the European
matter,
Union institutions
Jake.
be
These
in
things
Britain
do
after we've
matter.
left?
No, logically you're right. If you're left, they have to go. But it's a loss. It is a loss, especially the European Medicines Agency. It's a loss. And it's a loss of jobs, and it's a loss of an important institution that used to do, you know, pan-European work. So, yes, I mean, you know, for Brexiters, it's not a loss. For Remainers, it does feel like a very unfortunate thing is happening and has started to happen.
Well, I'll accept being logically right.
That's the first time I've ever heard Yasmin say, no, logically you're right, but. Let's move to another story, though, on the front page, and this is one which has been generating a number of column inches, first in The Sun and then in every other newspaper. The decision by Everton to ban Sun journalists from its matches, from its premises. Probably not desperately surprising, I suggest.
No, I mean, Yasmin and I disagree on this. I mean, I think really what it comes down to is when Kelvin Mackenzie called this player a gorilla, was he being racist or was he just being very, very rude? Now, I just cannot believe that a man like Kelvin Mackenzie or any other British journalist would knowingly say, here before me is a footballer with black heritage, and call him a gorilla. I cannot see that. Yes, it was rude, it was insensitive, particularly around the time of the anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster, and Kelvin Mackenzie, of all people, doing it, but I just cannot bring myself to say that was racist. But you disagree?
For me, it is racist. Now, I know Kelvin. He wrote a book with me, actually defending migration. You know, I don't think he's the devil at all. But I think on this one, how can you not know this guy's... He looks mixed race, and with my eyes...
He does.
Well, through my eyes, I was driven by a black cab driver. The thing the black driver said to me is, how can they not see his mixed race?
We're talking about through Kelvin Mackenzie's eyes, not through your eyes.
But then he has to see that for other people, what he said was racist. So you can't just say it wasn't racist. As far as black and Asian people and mixed race people, this is so obvious. Gorilla is a word that was used, is still used by the Ku Klux Klan, by the BNP and so on to describe, you know, they used it to describe Michelle Obama not that long ago. You just don't use it.
I just think it was unfortunate.
But Jake, even if Kelvin Mackenzie was unaware, where were the subs? Where were the sub-editors and where was the editor on this? It was all very well for the Sun to suspend him post hoc.
You're right.
That's right.
How did this get
there was a photo, there was a picture of a gorilla's eyes on the page. I mean, don't tell me that the Sun sub-editors or Sun editors and so on all thought, this is a black man, let's put a picture of a gorilla on the page. I mean, I don't think that happened. Yes, it was rude and objectionable, particularly around this sort of time of year.
I mean, that's the key point, though, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Kelvin Mackenzie is going to be having a pop at Liverpool, you know, until time immemorial. Don't do it now.
Quite right.
But for me, that's not the big issue. It is a very important anniversary. It is about, because I think we're now living in times where there's a free-for-all on racism. Everybody feels they can say what they want in the public space, and therefore,
I think
it is in the playground. I mean, teachers are reporting it. So somebody as senior a journalist as Kelvin, as I said, I don't think is the devil, should be aware of the atmosphere too.
I see it the opposite way, actually. I think these days there's a free-for-all about mob justice, of bringing people down for comments they made inadvertently without, because of contravening the politically correct.
Innocent in your eyes, it's not.
I'm not saying everything is innocent, but I'm saying that if you start to criminalise or criticise everything as being guilty, as being a manifestation of great evil, then you lose the power to criminalise or to criticise the things that really are.
It's up to those people who are at the receiving end to say, actually, this is how it makes us feel. That too is part of the freedom of expression.
We might return to this next hour, but let's get our last story in. And it turns out that Prince Charles is related to vampires. Or have I misread the story entirely?
Not quite vampires, but apparently the Prince of Wales is due to become the Prince of Wales and Transylvania, because there has been a discovery that he is the great-grandson 16 times removed to Vlad the Impaler. Apparently the Prince of Wales is said to have commented, "Transylvania is in my blood."
He's been on one of those genealogy websites this weekend, isn't he? Just doing a little bit of research, and he discovers this thing. One to be proud of, Vlad the Impaler?
Well, anything to be a bit more macho. I think for Prince Charles, the great challenge is to be a bit more macho. So Vlad's blood might do it.
Talks to plants, drinks blood, Prince Charles. In a few words there. Yasmin, Jake, we will see you again at 11:30. Time for us, though, to take a look at the weather. Well, as you can see, you're watching Sky News, and of course, it's time for the press preview. So we'll be taking a look at the headlines tonight with the columnist Yasmin Alibhai-Brown and the Mail Online associate editor Jake Wallis-Simons. Even to you both. But first, let's have a look at some of the front pages that we have. Here's the Sunday Times. It reports that US military advisors have told the UK that Donald Trump could launch a preemptive strike to neutralise North Korea's nuclear programme. The Mail on Sunday goes with North Korea's unveiling of what appears to be, certainly no confirmation, a new array of missiles. The Sunday Telegraph, well, it says that tension between the rogue state and the United States has reached new levels, with fears that one of those missiles unveiled could hit the west coast of America. The Sunday Express also leading with that story. Here's the Observer. It goes with new figures which show that the government's Free Schools programme benefits more prosperous areas in the south of England than others. The Sunday Mirror leads with an interview with chef Jean-Christophe Novelli, the paper reporting he came close to losing his son and fiancée. Well, once again, we're joined by Yasmin Alibhai-Brown and Jake Wallis-Simons. Evening, both. And let us start, shall we, with the story which has been dominating news agendas around the world and even here on Sky News all day. The Sunday Telegraph, the fears, the long-standing fears, that Kim Jong-un has actually developed that weapon which could hit the west coast of the United States.
Yes, but it could also do a lot of damage to neighbouring countries. And I think if we're living in a globalized world, it should worry us a lot. I just wish people would calm down over this a little bit and not move us to the brink. I mean, it's quite interesting. On the front page story of the Sunday Telegraph, they quote a group of British parliamentarians who are looking experts on North Korea. One of them, Geoffrey Clifton Brown, co-chairman of the all-party group on North Korea, said, and he's right, we should bring some sanity into this and not go to the edge. I just can't believe the timing, how quickly it's all pushed us to the brink. And we remember Cuba and Kennedy. Remember these moments. Don't take us there, I feel.
Well, I think that the timing is actually quite an astonishing thing in a good way. I mean, Obama sat on this problem for 8 years. Other presidents have failed to get to grips with it, even coming to the brink in the past. And yet Trump, in just a few short days, has changed the geopolitical dynamic to such an extent that China is now putting pressure on North Korea to start to draw back its horns.
But it is something when it's the Chinese that are being praised for the moderate tone that they're striking in this whole discussion.
Well, the Chinese deserve praise because they are changing their policy very, very quickly under pressure from Trump. And, you know, I'm not Trump's biggest fan in most cases, but I think, you know, you've got to give the man credit where credit is due. This is a problem that was not going to just go away.
But
sooner or later, somebody has got to deal with this problem. And by dealing with it now is much better than dealing with it at 2020 when they've got nuclear weapons.
No, Jake,
that can hit
we are going too close to the brink. We cannot afford anybody to be using their nuclear weapons. And this man in North Korea is mad enough. What if he uses it on his own people? What are we going to do?
Well, what's your alternative solution?
Well, look, it was contained. It was contained.
It wasn't contained. If you wait until 2020, it wasn't because they were pursuing their nuclear weapons program. They were pursuing the technology that would allow them to launch missiles at the West. Yeah. That was happening. Everybody predicted, all the experts predicted that by 2020 they were going to have nuclear weapons within range of the United States. Do we want to wait for that to happen?
We don't want a war. We do not want a war. We do not want a war.
Absolutely.
And I'm afraid that in Mr. Trump, I don't see a very temperate leader.
Well, I agree with you there, but I think that on this particular issue,
It's very
I think he's doing absolutely the right thing.
I mean, the story on any number of tomorrow's front pages. I mean, here's the Sunday Times. Donald Trump, it would appear, is even considering the option of a preemptive strike, which slightly surprises me, given that the rhetoric from the North Koreans is, look, if you do anything militarily, that's when we will move. So back off.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is that Trump knows that he could wipe North Korea off the face of the planet with America's military might. North Korea's military prowess is nothing compared to America's military capacity.
Yeah, but these are human
and the
beings.
point is, wait, let me just finish. And the point is that he knows that the North Koreans know that he has all the cards because he has all the power. And he's calling their bluff and forcing them to abandon their nuclear weapons program, which is in the interest of the whole world.
The nation is a very oppressed nation, oppressed by their leader, starved, tortured, beaten. Are we now going to send nuclear weapons to kill them off? I mean,
absolutely not. No, I'm not advocating that. But all I'm saying is that if you want them to abandon their nuclear weapons program, which we all do, the only way they're going to do that is if they believe there's a credible threat of force.
We did it with Iran. We got Iran to stop developing nuclear weapons.
Really? I'm sceptical about that.
But no. According to the inspectors, as we are now, they could start again. This is not the way you do it.
Well, politics isn't it the case that we don't yet know if the North Koreans have made a decision to back away from their nuclear problem? There is another option. There is the suicide option. There is the fact that Kim Jong-un is not a balanced individual by all accounts, and that he might take the doomsday option, be pushed to the brink and say, well, why not?
If that's the case, then why wait until 2020 when, according to all the experts, you're going to have 100 nuclear warheads with the capacity to hit Western Europe and to hit the United States? Why wait until then? This problem is not going to go away. You can't just kick it down the road.
Jake, you have to stop thinking in terms of just the West.
After year.
These are other human beings. We have to now think, no. The way you do this is not by antagonizing the whole world by talking about threat to the West. This man's a threat to Japan. He's a threat to China.
Absolutely.
He's a threat to many other nations.
And it's in all of their interests that the problem is resolved.
No, that problem is not resolved by using violence.
Yasmin, I've heard you say a few times the same. I think we all know that your position is that what America is doing is not the correct option. So what is? We can't keep saying, well, it's the Chinese,
No,
it's up to the Chinese. We can't keep saying it's up to the regional.
How long did you wait?
Because we've been there, we've done
But
that.
we have contained it too.
We
We
haven't.
have.
because he's continuing to develop his nuclear weapons program. So how's that contained?
We have contained it in that he's not done what he will do if America attacks. That's, to me...
He would do much worse if we left it.
Oh, I don't know.
Well, let's have a change of topic then, shall we? And perhaps we might find some common cause between the two of you here. The £1 billion negligence payout by the health service. It's a pretty big sum, isn't it?
This is a huge amount of money, isn't it? £1 billion in compensation to patients who suffered problems in their diagnosis and treatment, delays in their healthcare, and inaccurate diagnosis as well. I mean, this is just another indication of the woes that are afflicting the NHS. We know that it's falling apart at the seams. Waiting times in A&E are sky high. Targets are being missed right, left and centre. The NHS is having to shell out huge amounts of money to locums because there aren't enough doctors and nurses in the system. The NHS is crying out for reform, in my view. And I think
it's crying out for money as an alternative.
Yes, it's crying out for money.
In the
and also
years,
don't talk down
more money was
NHS.
thrown at the NHS and it didn't...
I'm not having that. I'm not having that. We have a fantastic National Health Service. I know it's had a terrible year. I know there are serious difficulties. And I do agree with you that this is absolutely not acceptable, where negligence then has to be paid for by this amount of money. And often it is because they close off when, there are bad examples of bad treatment instead of actually dealing with the problem. But I will not have the National Health Service talked down. We have the greatest...
Well, I'm not talking it down, but you're talking...
it does. Reform simply means more privatisation. It's not going to happen.
It's quite astonishing that you can look at a story which says £1 billion negligence payout by the NHS and then say, don't talk down the NHS.
No, but you gave us a whole essay.
I'm talking directly to this story and to the problems that are afflicting the NHS, and we can't sort them out if we don't recognise them. The problem in this country is that there's a sort of article of faith that we must not ever criticise the NHS. And where does that lead us? It leads us sort of into a blind state where we're looking at a story that says £1 billion negligence payouts and we're saying, don't talk down the NHS.
No. We can talk about the negligence pay, but I don't think we can then expand it to say what's wrong with the NHS and we must reform it. Because I know what that word means.
It's all in the story. A&E patients and barely any...
We can talk about that.
It's all in the story.
Yeah, but you were talking about a much broader range of ailments. And I'm saying to you, don't talk down our National Health Service, because according to 3 major international surveys, it beats every other system. And I'm not, yes, actually, shall I send you? No, I shall send you the 3 reports tomorrow. 3 of them, including those that we think are doing much better than us. We have a fantastic National Health Service. It saves lives. It saved my life. I'm not going to have it reformed with privatisation.
But isn't that the point, though, Yasmin? I mean, we can't even have a discussion about whether or not there should be elements of privatisation.
Even we're talking about a story about £1 billion.
But you see my point.
That's different.
There isn't even any debate about whether there should or should not be.
No, there is a debate, and many of us disagree with it, just like with grammar schools.
You're disagreeing with having the debate, though, because I was talking about...
No, I'm arguing with you. I'm not silencing you. I'm not gagging you.
No.
I'm saying no.
No, but what you are saying, you're accusing me of talking down the NHS.
Heaven forfeit. I want to move on to another story in the Mail on Sunday, and this is pages 4 and 5, and this is quite a complicated one, so please take us through this. The headline, The Crown Persecution Service.
This is an astonishing story. So it revolves around this Deputy Headmaster, Cato Harris, who was accused by a 14-year-old girl from a very rich background of raping her. And he was cleared by the court in just 15 minutes, so flimsy were the allegations. And what has now emerged, that the Mail on Sunday have revealed, is that this girl's wealthy family employed 2 people, gave them money. An ex-Scotland Yard Deputy Assistant Commissioner, who they employed as a private detective, and also the CPS's former principal legal advisor. And those 2 characters put pressure on the CPS to bring this trumped-up claim to court and to try to get this chap sent down for it. It's absolutely outrageous. If there's any question in anyone's mind, if this is true, if there's any question in anyone's mind whether corruption is alive and well today in Britain...
But a law firm was involved as well in some of this, wasn't there?
They did it through a law firm.
So what is the charge? The propriety of the CPS in bowing to this pressure?
So former senior members of Scotland Yard and the CPS phoned up their old colleagues who were still in the job and put pressure on them in a variety of ways to bring this case, even though the evidence didn't support it, because this 14-year-old girl's parents had a lot of money. It's outrageous, absolutely outrageous.
And yet, you know, as they say, on their side, the argument is what they did was perfectly legal. I mean, I'm with you on this. I totally think this should not be happening. But because there was a big, quite well-known law firm behind it, the legal loopholes were all covered.
Plenty of people have concerns about lobbying in terms of politics, lobbying in terms of the justice system.
Absolutely.
I imagine there'll be equally.
That doesn't happen. Do you think it happens often? It's quite a story.
Well, we may well find out. Yasmin, Jake, let us pause there. We will be back after this with this story. Prince Charles is honoured as kin to Vlad the Impaler, honestly. Welcome back to the press preview with Yasmin and Jake and myself. And in the break, we've been talking about horror movies, our favourites. I've been confessing my, the scare that I had when I watched Blair Witch Project by myself at my parents' home in the wilds of Ayrshire. Yeah, never again. But let's talk about Psycho. And it's been converted into a US TV series at Bates Motel. Mail on Sunday's found something to bang on about. What is it, Jake? Go on.
Well, this is quite absurd. They're remaking the iconic scene of where Norman Bates...
Spoiler alert, spoiler alert.
Where Norman Bates dresses up in his mother's clothes and attacks this lady with a knife in the shower. They're remaking it, but having him not wearing his mother's clothes for fear of offending the transgender community. So quite clearly, to my mind, this is political correctness gone mad. Yasmin may disagree, but to my mind, as a straight man, I'm quite offended by this because they're suggesting that straight white men are more likely to be psychos than transgender people.
You know?
So I think I should be offended. If anybody's going to be offended, it should be me.
No, I think this is fine. It's fine. They're not changing the story. They've still got...
They are.
No, they're only changing the clothing. They're not changing the story, they've said. And I think, you know, they're always the papers looking for political correctness gone mad stories. We've had Easter eggs, now we've got this. And I don't buy into any of this. Things change, society changes. It's not going to take anything away from the movie. And if you don't like it, don't watch it.
But do you think the transgender community would really be offended by watching Psycho as it was originally
But the thing is, back in the original Hitchcock, it wasn't to do with transvestism or transgenderism.
That's what he says.
It was to do with his relationship with his mother, which is why he put on the clothes.
Well, they've still got that, so you don't need the clothes.
You don't, oh, you can do it naked. Yasmin Alibhai-Brown's suggestion.
Yeah, you can do it naked, and then nobody will mind.
Let's stay with the Mail. Pages 18 and 19. I mean, the headline, the main article, the Mail on Sunday is really going for the Foreign Secretary at the moment. But Yasmin, you picked up on a story at the bottom there. Militant teachers have caned...
Well, actually, Jake picked that one up.
I picked that one up, yeah. This was the National Union of Teachers at their conference have taken a little break from discussing the problems of the school system, which is, you'd have thought, to be more in their area, to condemn Boris Johnson and Britain's, quote, armed interventions in the Middle East and elsewhere, and, surprise, surprise, show support for the rights of Palestinians. Now, what this has got to do with the NUT, I've got no idea. Their brief is schools, and this sort of mixing of affairs of education with a broader left-wing political agenda, I find very worrying indeed.
Oh, there's a long history of trade unions being involved in campaigning, surely.
Well, that's right, but this is not a campaign. This is, you know, they're having a conference to address
the problems with the school,
the problems in the school system, including lack of funding and lack of places and falling standards.
All political party conferences, they're a free-for-all there.
And they're spending time condemning Boris Johnson. I bet Boris Johnson is keeping him up at night thinking, oh, God, what are the NUT going to throw at me next?
Well, should we look at the main article proper? And frankly, Boris Johnson has not had an easy ride of it late, riding off to speak to his colleagues.
I wonder if he misses his own life. I wonder if he misses his own life, you know. Lots of money, writing columns, having a good life. No, I think this is quite unfair, actually. And I'm not, you know, I've never defended Boris before, but I do think they're gunning for him. Because what he said was sensible. He just didn't go about it in the right way, perhaps, or maybe it was impossible to convince the other nations of proper sanctions against Syria. We've not had proper sanctions against Syria forever.
Well,
but
I mean, I agree.
lost.
I think if you imagine that Boris Johnson had not tried to achieve an international consensus for sanctions against Syria. Imagine he sat on his hands, stayed at home in West London or in Islington and done nothing. Imagine the approbation he would have received in the press if he'd done nothing. And so, in a way, it's, damned if you do, damned if you don't.
But in terms, well, come on. When you heard that Boris Johnson was going to be the next Foreign Secretary, don't tell me that your immediate reaction was, yeah, that'll be good for him.
No, it's not a good appointment.
I think he's a very serious man. I think he's got a huge intellect, and I think he's very charismatic.
But why is it that we don't think of
abroad.
those qualities first when Boris Johnson's name is brought up?
Don't we?
I don't think he's a good appointment. That I do. I don't think, because what the Foreign Office has to do, which is kind of so many mind-bending games, really, with world affairs, he's a straight-speaking, sometimes too straight-speaking bloke, okay? Not for him. But on this, he was right. And I feel quite sad that he's had a bad week of it. It's not a job I think he must enjoy doing. Well,
I'm sure Boris Johnson will be very pleased, the rest of the Foreign Office is very pleased to hear that we have a new envoy to Transylvania. And it's top left there. Is that Vlad the Impaler? No, it's Prince Charles. Tell me.
Prince Charles, that's right. Well, apparently Prince Charles is related to Vlad the Impaler, who was so called because he would get his enemies and impale their heads on sticks and have that so thickly across Transylvania that it was mistaken for a forest. So perhaps they have environmental concerns in common. But apparently the Transylvanian representative suggested that Prince Charles would adopt this title, Prince of Wales and Transylvania, because he thought he might need a conversation starter.
Well, or some more macho image, the kind of twittering to plants and all this is actually kind of, well, I think, it would be a good macho addition to his profile.
Do you know what? I can think of worse people to claim a lineage to.
Can you?
Give me time. The next time we meet for the papers, I'll be sure to deliver it. Yasmin, Jake, thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.